Hello, and welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, Executive Editor of TNSR. On February 17th, Mercury Phoenix star Brittney Griner was detained and arrested in Russia, charged with carrying a vape pen that had hashish oil. Griner has been held since then and was only this week granted consular access where U.S. Embassy officials were able to visit her. It's hard to see her detention except in the light of the ongoing Russian invasion of Ukraine and the tensions that have arisen between Russia and the West. This may be an example of what some scholars call hostage diplomacy. In Volume 5, Issue 1 of TNSR, there's an outstanding article by Danielle Gilbert and Gael Rivard-Pesce that deals with the case of hostage diplomacy, and we're fortunate this week on Horns to be joined by one of the authors. Professor Gilbert, will you introduce yourself for us?
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for having me. My name is Danny Gilbert. I'm an assistant professor of military and strategic studies at the U.S. Air Force Academy. I'm also currently a non-resident fellow with the Modern War Institute at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. And I'm a fellow with the Bridging the Gap Project as well. Before I say anything else, I would just like to make a standard disclaimer that speaking on this podcast today, I am in my personal capacity. My views are my own. They do not represent the U.S. Air Force Academy, the Department of Defense, or the United States government.
We appreciate that, and it's always important to make sure that that's clear. So let's begin with a fairly basic question. What is hostage diplomacy?
Hostage diplomacy is the taking of hostages under the guise of law for use as foreign policy leverage. These cases operate in kind of a murky middle ground, somewhere between legitimate arrests and prosecutions on the one side and illicit kidnappings on the other side. At the beginning of a hostage diplomacy case, it resembles a lawful detention. The state arrests a foreigner, often suspected of espionage or some other criminal wrongdoing. They're detained and they are formally charged. But the pretense soon falls away, and the hostage diplomacy case ends with the state negotiating for the prisoner's release through a series of diplomatic or economic concessions. So somewhere along the way, the accused transitions from a prisoner to a bargaining chip. Legally, the victims are detainees, but functionally, they're hostages.
You've done a lot of work, I know, including a forthcoming article in the American Political Science Review, congratulations, on
Thank you.
The question of kidnapping in civil wars. How is hostage diplomacy different?
So in many ways, hostage diplomacy has similar elements to a kidnapping, that it's using protracted human captivity to compel concessions. But in two very, very important ways, hostage diplomacy is different from kidnapping. The first way that kidnapping and hostage diplomacy differ are the perpetrators. So kidnapping is almost always perpetrated by a non-state actor. That could be a rebel, a terrorist, a criminal, but it's usually not with the power of the state. Whereas hostage diplomacy, the perpetrator is a state. It's a government, often an authoritarian one. The other way that kidnapping and hostage diplomacy cases differ is about how the demands are expressed. In a kidnapping, the demands for concessions are often very explicit. Pay me $5 million and your loved one will come home. In a hostage diplomacy case, the demands are instead implied. They're rarely made explicit, and we usually only find out what kind of concessions might have been desired after a swap of some sort is made.
So when a state is confronted with an instance of hostage diplomacy, what choices do they have?
So in many ways, hostage diplomacy cases are easier to deal with than kidnappings by non-state actors. When there's a hostage diplomacy case, there's a return address. We know the identity of the perpetrator. We know the location of captivity. And governments, including the United States, also don't face the same restrictions on making concessions to state actors that we do face when making concessions to non-state actors. So, for example, the United States government has a prohibition on paying ransoms to designated foreign terrorist organizations. When the Islamic State, Al-Qaeda, or groups of a similar nature kidnap an American, it is against the law to pay a ransom because that would be material support of a terrorist organization. But when a state holds someone hostage, no such prohibitions exist. So it would be completely fine legally for the United States government to pay a foreign government, to swap prisoners with a foreign government, to make other kinds of foreign policy exchanges. That doesn't mean that they're necessarily morally acceptable or advisable in terms of foreign policy, but legally they don't face the same problem. There's always a moral hazard problem with making these kinds of concessions, that the government might fear that by making concessions, and if those concessions are known, it will incentivize future hostage takers to take more hostages. And then one other way that these cases differ is that rescue missions, which the United States government might launch to bring back a hostage held by a non-state actor, is typically not something the United States government is considering when dealing with hostage diplomacy cases.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. If you're going on a rescue mission, you can always make the unwilling or unable argument about the ability of the state in which the non-state actor is residing or functioning. But if you're doing it against a state, that is about the most blatant violation of sovereignty that you could conduct.
Precisely. I've got a bit of a detour, if you'll allow it, on the current context of how the United States deals with these various cases.
Sure.
So while Americans are arrested abroad pretty frequently in cases that we might consider to be fair or legitimate, there's also many cases that the U.S. considers arbitrary or unlawful when a foreign government arrests a foreigner. So last year, Congress passed a law called the Robert Levinson Hostage Recovery and Hostage Taking Accountability Act. And I can disclose here that in my personal capacity, I helped advise the Senate Foreign Relations Committee on drafting the bill. So one of the main things that this law did was formalize 2015 Obama administration executive order that created a new interagency hostage recovery infrastructure in the U.S. government, including an interagency body housed at the FBI called the Hostage Recovery Fusion Cell, a body at the National Security Council, and also a special office at the State Department called the Special Presidential Envoy for Hostage Affairs, which we know by the acronym SPIHA. So the SPIHA is the diplomatic representative of the U.S. government who is responsible for dealing with hostage recovery cases. And unlike the other hostage recovery bodies, which are strictly assigned to deal with kidnappings by non-state actors, the SPIHA office kind of wears two hats. They can deal with kidnapping cases, but they can also deal diplomatically with these cases of hostage diplomacy. And one of the main sections of this Robert Levinson law essentially tells the State Department when a case should be elevated to the SPIHA's office, instead of just focused at the level of consular affairs. So there are lots of different reasons why a case of an American detained abroad might be simply dealt with at the consular level. That person is arrested legitimately. We send consular officers to go visit them in prison, and things carry on accordingly. But there are also lots of reasons why we might suspect that an international detention is unlawful or unjust. And there's a lot of different reasons why we might consider a case to fall into that category. That person might be arrested because they are an American. The U.S. might possess credible evidence that the person is innocent. The person might be held specifically to extract concessions, or the United States might just have doubts about the legitimacy of the detaining country's justice system, including that that person is held in inhumane conditions or that due process is being violated. So functionally, if the Secretary of State determines that any of those criteria are met, the case should receive additional diplomatic attention, moving from the Consular Affairs Bureau into the office of the SPIHA.
So I'm curious about that because you talked about due process being violated. And due process is, while it sounds like one of these very objective standards, the question of how much process is due is very subjective. And there's the question of substantive versus procedural due process. How does the United States government go about determining whether a citizen detained abroad has been denied due process?
That is a great question. The law is new, and these criteria were a set of suggestions for figuring out which cases should go essentially to which office in the State Department. I would love a chance to speak with them and figure out how they are figuring this out, how they're determining where these cases belong. But they are based on things like international human rights organizations reports, reports from journalists, and other kinds of investigations.
So one of the things that strikes me, and you've seen this a lot in your other work, is that kidnapping is very often the weapon of the weak. I think of Somali pirates, for example, who lack leverage to gain access to resources or otherwise publicize their plight with the depletion of the fisheries on which they'd been dependent for so many years, and have found the ability to disrupt international trade as something that suddenly grants them a seat at the table. Mm-hmm. I think of various groups in South America and Latin America who exist outside the channels of power within government, who have found the ability to detain foreign nationals, particularly those associated with multinational corporations that have deep pockets, as a way, again, to find a voice, to get a seat at the table, and to enrich themselves at the same time. Mm-hmm. But there's something very different when a state does this. And there's some history of relatively marginal states doing this, the North Koreas, the Irans of the world. But we're looking at Russia. Russia is a permanent member of the UN Security Council. They possess a vast nuclear arsenal. Why would a powerful state like Russia turn to something that's traditionally a weapon of the weak?
It's a great question. And I will say it's not just Russia. There are many of those maybe weaker states a little bit more on the outside, including North Korea or Iran, Cuba, for instance, that have used this tactic for a long time. And in recent years, we've seen it being used by China and by Russia, right? These permanent members of the UN Security Council, nuclear states, great powers. And it's been very puzzling. In some ways, we can think of it as these states stepping out and testing the waters, kind of pushing the boundaries of the liberal world order to see how the international community will respond. In other ways, we can think of it as coercive diplomacy with plausible deniability. So they're looking for leverage against the United States, against other powerful states in the West, and even middle powers. That's what our article in TNSR is about. But they want to do it in a way that is plausibly deniable. It's through the guise and the color of law to pretend in a way, to put up a facade that they're not doing what they are very much in fact doing. One of the ways that coercive diplomacy and hostage diplomacy is most often used by these states is for prisoner swaps specifically. So they have their own citizens who are arrested, and then they start arresting Westerners to try to coerce an exchange. The same thing that the United States and the Soviet Union did during the Cold War, and the same thing that non-state actors do all the time. The FARC in Colombia, the group that I spend most of my time thinking about and studying, kidnapped thousands of members of the Colombian state to use for this kind of exchange. And we see that exchange as being particularly effective because it's a like for like, it's a tit for tat, really thinking about it as, easy to exchange one person for another. There's really an equivalence there. And I think another reason that we see these states using it is there's an assumption that democracies are going to go to great lengths to protect and to recover their own citizens. So states like China and Russia might assume that there's going to be a lot of public pressure on the U.S. government to make these concessions to convince them to help bring the prisoners home. So those are some of the reasons why I think they might be using it, especially right now.
So you talked a bit about China and the infamous Two Michaels case, which you and Gael dive into some detail on in the TNSR article. Mm-hmm. For our listeners who may not be as familiar with it, can you just kind of give us a summary of what that case was about and how it was resolved?
Absolutely. So this case was a very, very big deal in Canada. I know some listeners here might be familiar with it, but as a brief synopsis, in December of 2018, the Canadian government arrested Meng Wanzhou, who was the chief financial officer of the Chinese telecom giant Huawei. Meng was arrested at the request of the United States based on allegations that she had violated Iran sanctions and that she had committed bank fraud. Within days of her arrest in Canada, China arrested 2 Canadian citizens who were living in China, and they are known as the quote-unquote 2 Michaels. So it's former diplomat Michael Kovrig and businessman Michael Spavor. Within a couple of months, the 2 Michaels were charged with espionage. And what is interesting and quite striking about the way that these cases unfolded were the way that these prisoners were differently treated. So Meng was given a house arrest in her various mansions in Vancouver. There were multiple articles about how she was spending her time painting and catching up on reading and, kind of having a relaxing time. The Michaels faced horrific treatment. They were often in solitary confinement. For a long time, they were denied even consular access. So this went on for several years until September of 2021. And at that point, the U.S. Justice Department reached a deferred prosecution agreement with Meng, in which the United States dropped its charges and recommended that Canada release her from her house arrest. So as soon as she was released, mere hours later, the Canadian government announced that the Michaels were coming home. So one of the ways that we can most with most confidence look at this case and say that it was hostage diplomacy is if we look at the timing. We look at the tit for tat, the fact that every time something happened to Meng, immediately within days or hours even, some equivalent thing happened to the Michaels. So that's pretty strong indication that what we're looking at is hostage diplomacy. But interestingly, throughout this entire ordeal, including at the conclusion of the case, the United States, Canada, and China, all governments, all officials denied that the cases were connected in any way.
So I realize that it's early days yet on the Brittney Griner saga, and that there's a lot of information that isn't yet publicly available. But based on what you know and have been able to see, how is this case similar or different from the 2 Michaels case? And do you think it is an example of hostage diplomacy?
It's honestly a really hard question, Doyle. So one of the tricky things about hostage diplomacy is that sometimes it can be really difficult to distinguish on the surface from other forms of international detention. It's not difficult for us to imagine how her arrest might be used right now for Russian leverage against the United States in Russia's ongoing war with Ukraine. We can imagine that she might be held to pressure the U.S. government to lessen its sanctions, to not get involved in the conflict in some way. And in some sense, I can also say, in my personal capacity and not representing the U.S. government, it's almost irrelevant whether or not she even had illicit substances in her luggage, since the Russian government is going to continue to act as if it's true and detained her in a justice system that the United States has lots of reasons not to trust. So what I can say is that I don't have any special evidence to suggest that she is being held specifically to extract concessions. But there is lots of reason that the United States might doubt the legitimacy of the justice system that she is being held in. And particularly when she is not alone in this right now. So there are 2 other Americans who have been detained in Russia, Trevor Reed, who's been held since 2019, and Paul Whelan, who's been held since 2020. And there's evidence that both of them were arrested and are being held to pressure the United States to release 2 Russian intelligence agents that are arrested in the United States. So what I would say is, for the sole reason that the United States government might not trust the legitimacy of the Russian judicial system, I would expect that this case should be transferred from the Consular Affairs Bureau at the State Department and brought into the SPIHA office, the Special Presidential Envoy for Hostage Affairs. I would imagine that regardless of the facts of the case, that this is not the kind of case that the United States can ignore in a way, that we would imagine that there are higher level diplomatic impacts of this case, and that there are probably conversations happening behind the scenes about her care, about her treatment, about her sentencing, and hopefully also about her release.
Yeah, and in her case, it's made all the more delicate given the Russian government's official position on homosexuality and the
Mm-hmm.
use of questions about that in some of the information operations that we've seen, or at least statements being made by the Russian Orthodox Church and others to try to link issues in Ukraine to United States positions and various conspiracies and things like that. So it becomes an even more complicated question.
Completely.
So one of the things that really strikes me is there's a couple of things in international relations that are sort of universally regarded as good. And one of those things is sovereignty. And, while it's easy in the case of things like responsibility to protect to see where sovereignty can go wrong, at the same time, there are very few other concepts in international relations that have survived since 1648 and done as much to reduce or eliminate interference, war, harm. The other one, and it's a comparatively newer concept, but again, often regarded as sort of a presumptive good, is the question of rule of law.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, it strikes me that hostage diplomacy weaponizes both of these concepts, doesn't it?
Absolutely. So I would say that states that are using hostage diplomacy are really taking advantage of both of these elements, and very intentionally. They're adopting this very intentionally to increase their foreign policy leverage by pretending to follow the very rules that they are violating themselves. I think it's important, actually, that these states are arresting people and charging them and moving these cases through their justice system, even if we feel that the justice system is completely arbitrary, if the cases are never meant to be a legitimate case as part of the criminal justice system, but to pretend that they are, and to hold it up as an example of arguing why what they're doing is legitimate, and saying that we're doing exactly the same thing that you are doing. The flip side of that, and as I alluded to before, it means that the United States and other countries are almost certainly not planning hostage recovery missions. We are not planning to go in typically to rescue people who are held in another state's prisons. And so in some way, the perpetrators of these cases know that the United States and other adherents of a liberal world order and a rules-based international system, that those states are going to be fighting with one hand tied behind their back, that we are not going to be using all of our possible approaches to bringing someone out of one of these situations. And so we wouldn't expect that kind of response. And so it's really hitting democracies precisely where it hurts. It's using these concepts in a hypocritical way to lock democracies into a very, very difficult situation for how they will respond.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of the sort of stereotypical situation where the big burly guy at the bar says something like, "You got a problem with what I'm saying?" And the answer is, of course you do. But to make that explicit would be ill-advised at that moment. And so it leaves you stuck dealing with a situation that everyone recognizes, but no one can acknowledge.
Precisely.
So there's a quote that's attributed to Stalin that goes to the effect of the death of one person is a tragedy, but the death of a million is a statistic.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that strikes me about both kidnapping and hostage diplomacy is that it takes a cause that may be large and diffuse, and it suddenly puts a single, very human face on it. How does the personalization of that issue change the calculus of a state in dealing with it?
Oh, I love that you brought up that dynamic, Doyle, because it's certainly one of the things that first interested me in studying these concepts, and that I think it makes them so powerful. So for the family or for the community or for the employer of the hostage, there's nothing in the world that is more important than getting that person home, right? Than getting their loved one home. But it's not just about the family or the employer focusing on their loved one. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that captivity of a single named individual is a really effective way to dramatically increase attention. So the Stalin quote that you mentioned is a terrific example. Like so much of our work in the field of international security, this again can be traced to Tom Schelling as well. So Tom Schelling first wrote in a piece called "The Life You Save Could Be Your Own," about this phenomenon. So he sketches out a scenario where a community is asked to pitch in just a little bit of money to help save the local hospital system, and no one is willing to donate. But then the hospital decides instead to highlight the plight of one particular sick child and describes her eyes and her hair, and the donations come flooding in. So people are exceptionally willing to pay attention, to make concessions, to sacrifice when it's for a single named individual. And so we certainly see this to be the case with kidnapping. In some of my other work, I've studied media coverage of Americans kidnapped overseas. And one of the things that I find is that the more hostages that are taken in a single event, the less media coverage any of them receive. So a single hostage kidnapped alone will get far more newspaper stories written about him or her than if a group of people is kidnapped together. So there's an expectation that there can be some public sustained attention when we see one of these cases. And I think it applies both to kidnapping by non-state actors and to these cases of hostage diplomacy. The problem is that this poses a real dilemma for government targets who receive these demands, explicit or implied, for various concessions. Because while the public might be paying a lot of attention to these cases, the government is often asked to make concessions that specifically pit the plight of this individual against U.S. foreign policy interests. And so it's asking to make concessions that would violate the U.S. national interest and national security interest to get that person home. And so that's a real dilemma for policymakers, especially if the case is getting a lot of public attention. And one thing that I can say anecdotally, I've started thinking about this for some research, but I don't have any data to present, is that it really seems like in other countries, there's much more public outcry for these cases than there is in the United States. And so there might not be as much pressure on the US government to respond to these cases in a certain way as there might be in some of our other Western allies, like in Canada for the two Michaels, like the kind of response we've seen in the past for hostages in France or in Israel, for example.
Yeah, it'd be kind of fascinating to compare that to a nation's recent experience in war and casualties to see if that has any effect on the degree to which a single story is salient and motivating in that way. But it also strikes me that that opens up an avenue for a savvy state, and Russia has proven itself to be extremely savvy in this regard, to choose who they detain in such a way that it's likely to augment divisions within society and to create domestic pressures and frictions on the government responding in a way where it's likely to either be seen as that the response is influenced negatively or positively because the detained person belongs to a group whose identity and affinity is associated with one political party or another.
Yeah, there's a concept called the missing white woman syndrome, which you and some of your listeners might have heard of. That essentially when a young white female victim of an abduction is taken, that she will get far more attention than an equivalent hostage or kidnapped victim who is not white or not female. And that has been tested time and time again in the US context and found to be true domestically in the United States. My research on the media coverage of Americans kidnapped abroad doesn't find a significant effect for gender or for race of the reported hostage and media coverage, but it's also a very, very small sample size, and so it might be difficult to know. But what I did find is that when multiple hostages were taken together, that the female and white hostages, and the white hostages in particular, received far more media coverage than persons of color who were kidnapped alongside them. And so within cases, there was far less coverage of Black or Latinx hostages who were taken captive somewhere abroad.
Yeah, it's a little bit depressing to realize the role in which that can play in dictating the pressure that is exerted on a government to respond.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm curious, because we're talking a bit about the pressure that's generated by media coverage. Does publicity and media coverage help or hurt in cases of hostage diplomacy? And is that different in hostage diplomacy from kidnapping?
This is often the big question. There's a real debate about this that's happening all the time. So, kind of the big debate in kidnapping cases is, should we pay ransoms? And the big debate in hostage diplomacy is, should we publicize this? Should families go to the news? Should we be protesting in the streets about Brittany Griner? This is what people are often asking. So in some ways, publicity can raise the stakes. So we might be afraid that publicity can make the perpetrating state see their prisoner as more valuable. If they think that their prisoner is more valuable, they might demand more concessions. And so that might make it harder. So in some ways, if Russia saw that there was a lot of public attention to this case, it might make things harder for her. This is the logic behind keeping things quiet, not talking about her case often in the news, and trying to resolve things behind closed doors. There's another side to this argument, which says that we need to be in the streets. We need to be raising the stakes. There should be publicity about Brittany Griner and about all of these other cases. And Jason Rezaian, who was a victim of hostage diplomacy, he was held in Iran for 544 days. He wrote a wonderful book about it. And he made the case in the book that the attention to his case really helped him. It helped him get some new beneficial treatment while he was in captivity, because it put pressure on the regime to treat him better in his imprisonment, essentially. There's a question, too, about the efficacy of naming and shaming authoritarian regimes. And so will it affect China or Russia if the rest of the world is calling them out and calling these detentions arbitrary or unlawful in some way? One thing that I will say that publicity really might do is that it's not about pressuring the perpetrator. It's really about pressuring the United States government to act. And so a lot of these publicity campaigns, they kind of have two audiences. In one sense, they're about communicating with the perpetrators, communicating with the hostage-taking state, but also communicating with the U.S. government and saying, we're not going to sit down and be quiet. We are going to continue to pressure you to demonstrate that you are acting on this case. One thing that really sticks with me that Rob Saley, who was the former director of the Hostage Recovery Fusion Cell, has said, and I've heard him say it a couple of times, is that the attention that we put on these cases really drives this moral hazard problem. So he specifically points to the Trump administration and says that because the Trump administration publicized and highlighted hostage diplomacy cases so much during President Trump's time in office, that it in effect put a target on the back of every American traveling around the world abroad, because it taught every state with any beef against the U.S. government that all you have to do is arrest an American, and then you get the full attention of the Oval Office. And in the same way, presidents that welcome home hostages and detainees with a big ceremony in the Rose Garden, with an Oval Office press conference, anything like that, it's really elevating the stakes and telling would-be hostage takers around the world that this is going to be a way to get the attention of the White House.
Yeah, and it makes me think of one of the first and most celebrated cases of hostage diplomacy, but one we sometimes don't group in that, which of course was the taking of the 52 American hostages at the embassy in Tehran. And when President Carter adopted the Rose Garden strategy of saying, I'm going to stay in Washington, stay in the White House until the hostages are released, he at that point gave the government of Iran an extraordinary amount of control over his reelection prospects, over the way in which the case was handled domestically. It certainly contributed to the development of the television show America Held Hostage, which morphed into Nightline and launched Ted Koppel's hair into a career of great prominence. So yeah, it's fascinating the degree to which that plays a role. So one of the things that I find most frustrating in dealing with another person is when I know they want something, but I can't figure out what it is and they won't tell me. And yet, as you mentioned, in the cases of hostage diplomacy, states are often not explicit about what it is they're looking for. So other states are kind of left to guess. And I guess I'm wondering why states would do that if there's some advantage that's conferred by that, and what the risks are associated with that on both sides.
That's great. So I've just been teaching my students about coercion, about deterrence and compellence, and we have talked a lot in my class about the importance of communication and when being very clear about your capabilities or your demands is really important. And conversely, when being vague can also confer some pretty effective advantages. And very proud they did a really excellent job at kind of guessing the kind of scenarios when it might be more and less useful to be clear with your communication.
So you mentioned that the degree of publicity can affect the degree to which states turn to this tactic. Do you anticipate that the success of high-profile cases like the Two Michaels case, and if there in fact is any advantage gained by Russia as a consequence of the 3 Americans they have detained right now, do you expect that that may result in an increase in the use of this tactic by other states?
I think that's a really important question for us to be able to answer. I think that knowing the answer to that question should shape how the United States should think about dealing with these cases. So on the one hand, it's really hard to know if these cases are on an upswing of any sort. So reasons that it's hard to know if these cases are increasing is that, first of all, they're not always publicized. We don't always even know if they're happening. It's also possible that it seems like there's more of these cases these days because Gael and I and other scholars have put this term of hostage diplomacy on it. And by naming something, it makes it more identifiable out there in the world. Even though there's a fairly long history of states using this tactic, China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, Egypt, Turkey, and a list of others. So the tactic is not new, but it seems like it is increasing. And there's a few reasons to suspect that it might be. So one of them, as I mentioned before, was the tremendous amount of attention that the Trump administration gave these cases. President Trump referring to himself as the greatest hostage negotiator in the history of the United States, and airing a segment during the Republican National Convention where he brought all of these former prisoners to the White House to talk about what the U.S. did to bring them home. That really might tell states that this is a good idea for them to adopt this tactic. There are some really prominent journalists and experts on this subject that have argued recently that it's increasing. So Jason Rezaian has recently written in the Washington Post about hostage diplomacy and about how these cases are really increasing. Joel Simon recently had an article in The New Yorker arguing that these cases are on the rise. And the advocacy organizations that I know of in the United States, including the Foley Foundation and Hostage US, both of these organizations who deal very closely with the families of hostages and detainees abroad, these organizations have said that the majority of the cases that they are dealing with now are now these unlawful detention cases rather than kidnapping cases. So they're seeing an increase in terms of their clientele, if you will, in terms of the families that they're helping. The last way that this might be increasing, regardless of publicity, regardless of anything that current or former administrations may have done, is that it's in line with shifting U.S. foreign policy priorities around the world. So we are now pivoting from 20 years of wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and from a focus on combating terrorism and non-state actor threats, moving toward a focus on strategic competition, or what we used to call great power competition. And so if we think about what that shift means, the move from kidnapping by non-state actors to hostage taking by states might just be a small part in that broader foreign policy shift. So in some ways, it might simply reflect the kinds of conflicts and challenges that the U.S. is facing now around the world.
So one final question, and you've alluded to this several times in your answers up to this point, but as you said, a state has very limited recourse when another state detains one of its citizens. We're not going to go launch a rescue mission into Russia. Mm-hmm. So given that, why bother with the charade of a judicial process? Why not just grab the guy? Why not just hold on him and say, yeah, I've got this guy and let's start talking?
So in some ways, I think, as I mentioned before, that the pretense and the facade is really important. I think it undercuts international opposition with a false equivalence in a way. So when China arrested the two Michaels after the arrest of Meng Wanzhou, they were saying, in effect, two things to the world community. First of all, the Michaels broke our laws and we can legitimately arrest them. And that's appealing to a rules-based order that cares about the rule of law. At the same time, they were also saying that should you suggest that these arrests are arbitrary, we're going to say the same thing right back at you, Canada and the United States. And that states like Russia and China blame the US for doing the very same thing. And so it really makes that language difficult. One thing that I can say about this is that often the way that a hostage diplomacy case is resolved is a much broader agreement than just the release of the prisoners. So a deferred prosecution agreement for Meng Wanzhou and the immediate release of the two Michaels is an exception. It's maybe not the norm. And when we look at the way that some of these cases have been resolved in the last 10 years, let's say, a lot of them were resolved as part of much broader foreign policy negotiated agreements. So Jason Rezaian and several other prisoners were released from Iran as part of the 2015 JCPOA. It was both states putting more options on the table. It was saying, we're already coming to the negotiating table for an agreement about nuclear weapons, about what our diplomacy looks like between our two countries. Oh, let's also throw some money in there from the Shah. Oh, let's also add some prisoners and send them home. Alan Gross was released from Cuba as part of a much broader negotiation about U.S.-Cuban diplomatic relations. And so I think in some ways, states are not only seeing this individual element of leverage and trying to make a case of false equivalence in some way, but they might have their eyes on some sort of larger prize. And the more things that they can put in their arsenal to eventually put on the table, they see that as continuing ways to increase their leverage.
Any wrap-up thoughts, especially as we think about it in the context of the Brittany Griner case and the ongoing tensions between the West and Russia as Russia prosecutes an aggressive war in Ukraine?
So the thing I will be paying most attention to with this case is any mention whatsoever of her case being handled by the SPIHA. So far, all of the press that I have read or watched or listened to about Brittany Griner has at the most really referred to her case being referred to consular affairs. It's wonderful that we can confirm that someone from the U.S. Embassy in Russia has been able to visit, that she's had these consular affairs visits. But I would be watching for a mention of this SPIHA office for any sort of indication that that the United States government is thinking about her case as a case of hostage diplomacy, if we should start thinking about it as something that will be part of other leverage and pressure that the United States can continue to put on Russia to withdraw from Ukraine.
Thanks so much. We've been speaking with Professor Danny Gilbert, co-author along with Gael Rivard-Pichy in Volume 5, Issue 1 of TNSR of Caught Between Giants, an article about hostage diplomacy, and we've been interrogating the question of whether hostage diplomacy may be playing a role in the ongoing tensions between Russia and the West over the war in Ukraine. Thanks for joining us, Danny. I really appreciate it. It's been a great conversation.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, and please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.